All right. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Karin Steuber. She's coming to us from the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society, and she's going to be doing a presentation for us today entitled "It's More Than Just Stones and Bones, How Archaeology Can Tell a Story." So I will pass it over to you there, Karin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Em. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this windy morning. At least it's windy where I am. Thank you to Mass for asking me to speak on this. I think it's a very important considering of how much archaeology that we do have in the province. So what I'm going to do is do a little presentation for you. And let's see if it will work for me. There we go. Everybody's good?
Looks good.
Awesome. All right. So as Em said, I am with the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. I'm their public outreach coordinator, but I do a little bit of everything. We are a small nonprofit organization based in Saskatoon, but we travel and work throughout the province. So there's 2.5 positions there, 3 of us, awesome co-workers, great place to work. As an archaeologist, I've done everything from academic, university-related archaeological projects to private industry, and now working for a nonprofit society. So I've got a little bit of experience in archaeology of the Canadian prairies and the Northern Plains region. So today, we're going to go through exactly what archaeology in Saskatchewan looks like, and then how these artifacts that you may find in your collections or have had donated to your museums can be used more than just a stone or a bone or a piece to sit there in a display case. All right, so we have over 10,000 years of human history in Saskatchewan. Everything going back at least 12,000 years before present, you know, at the end of the Ice Age, people were in the province, despite the fact that large portions of the province were covered by glacial ice. Where there wasn't glacial ice, people were here. They were following animal herds, and they were eking out a living in much harsher conditions than we have to deal with today. We often split the archaeological history of the province into kind of 2 time periods, the pre-contact and the historic period. So pre-contact is everything prior to European colonization, and then the historic is everything past that. So once you have the arrival of Europeans and Euro-Canadian settlement on the prairies here. There is a brief period kind of in between where we have the appearance of European trade goods in Saskatchewan, but no actual Europeans here yet. We call this kind of a proto-contact period. So we just have artifacts from Europeans, but not themselves yet. All right, so I'm sure you've all seen these types of artifacts before. One of the most common Saskatchewan archaeological artifacts out there are those made of stone. So we've got everything from your typical arrowheads, hammerstones, grooved mauls, some people call them tomahawks. I'm sure every museum has a box of these grooved mauls here. So what happens when we see artifacts like that is we tend to classify them. So in the terms of arrowheads, we divide them into 3 kind of separate types. Altogether, they're called projectile points. So you have everything from spear points that date back to that very early period, the 10,000 years plus, that would have been used on the tips of spears to hunt large Ice Age megafauna and the ancestors of modern day bison. In and around 7,500 years ago, we have a technological shift where people in North America switched to a new type of hunting technology known as atlatl or dart technology. So I'll show you a picture in a few slides on it, but basically you have an extension of your arm that allows you to throw your spear point faster, harder, and further, so you don't have to get as close to these animals. And then we see the rise of bow and arrow technologies in and about 2,000 years ago. So with time And with improvements in technology, we see a decrease in the size of these projectile points. So, and everything from, I would say 5 inches spear points down to tiny, tiny little arrowheads that can, even though they look super small and they're maybe only 1 to 2 centimeters or a half an inch in length, that they can still take down a full-grown bison. Other things that we see being made out of stone are a variety of other tools, such as scrapers for hide cleaning. We have knives for cutting, instrument awls and drills for making holes or etching wood. Not as common because they tend to be smaller and they break quite easily. So you may have an awl or a drill in your collection and not realize it because it's been broken. The two items on the center of the screen with the blue background, those are scrapers. So they would have been either hafted or attached to some sort of handle, and they would have been used for cleaning bison hides, right, to get them nice and clean. The groove mauls vary. You can either find them with that groove that has been pecked or ground out around the center, or sometimes they don't have grooves at all. They're mauls. They would have been used for a hammer to weigh things down, like the edges of teepee hide coverings. The groove does facilitate hafting onto a handle to use it as a hammer. We often get people coming in saying that they're tomahawks and they're used as a weapon, but honestly, there's not a lot of historical evidence for the use of tomahawks. Up here, this was much more of an American phenomenon, and especially in later periods where you tend to have larger congregations of people as population size is increasing. So the grand majority of these mauls with the groove that you find are just woodworking or hammers, right? That they're not actually being used as part of warfare. All right, another common objects that we do find in Saskatchewan archaeology are pottery. So pottery starts to occur around 2,000 years ago, right around the same time that bow and arrow technology came about. This is using natural clays, adding materials such as like tiny gravel, sands, crushed shell and things like that to the clay matrix to help stabilize it, make it stronger, and then forming it into pots for cooking, for storage. Oftentimes we don't find them nicely complete. We find them in tiny, tiny little pieces. There is about 6 different varieties throughout Saskatchewan. 4 tend to be more plains-based, so more Saskatoon and area south. And then we have a couple of varieties that are found more in boreal or northern sites up in around the Clearwater River and Churchill River areas as well. The neat thing about pottery is when you do find it, if you find the right pieces, especially the upper rims or the shoulders, they often have decoration on them. And that can help us to determine how old that piece of pottery is. Pottery has been dated when it is found in archaeological sites, usually with organic materials like bones, to give us an actual calendar date. So we know that pottery from Mortlach peoples is in and around, 500 years old, based on the decoration that's found on it. As well, projectile points, those arrowheads, those spear points, they all tend to have a date range associated with them too. Exactly the same as pottery. They've been dated in conjunction with organic materials like bone and archaeological sites to give us that calendar age. And of course, archaeologists like to classify everything, so everything's given a unique name, right? So we have Mortlach pottery, Besant pottery, Avonlea. We have McKean projectile points and Besant projectile points, Clovis, things like that too. So we can often associate a rough date to the year, give or take a few years on archaeological sites. We're not going to get an exact date unless there's some sort of written record, which oftentimes archaeologists don't have the luxury of dealing with, at least not until the historic period, right? Prior to European colonization, there was no historical record for Indigenous groups in North America. They didn't write down their histories, so everything we are basing it on is a result of inquiry and scientific exploration over time, as well as talking with Indigenous groups today to learn about their traditional histories. All right, another common thing we find in archaeological sites within the province, bones. Bones of varying types, animal bones from bison predominantly, but as well as other animal species, deer, moose, elk, caribou in the north, rabbits, bird bones, whooping crane is fairly common in sites in eastern Saskatchewan in and around the Nipawin area, partially because it's part of a migratory bird route. These bones can be either just the remnants of hunting or food processing activities, or in some cases, they've been fashioned into tools over time as well. So what we have here on the screen is we have a couple of pictures of bones that have just been cracked open to extract the marrow from within. Bone marrow is a high caloric density food, so it would have been eagerly sought after by groups in the past to get the maximum amount of nutrients so that they could withstand our lovely Saskatchewan winters out there. But in some cases too, people would use these bones to fashion them into tools. So the bottom picture, there we go. This bottom picture here is a bone flesher. So it's been kind of has an oblique cut on it. And what they've done is they've tried to make an edge on this long bone that they can use for hide cleaning purposes as well. The other bone tool that you see here is this large picture of a snowshoe needle, right? So bone could be used for larger tools such as the flesher, but also finely, ground down and cut down to make needles, awls as well for sewing purposes. The most common bone that we find in Saskatchewan archaeological site is, as you would expect, belonging to bison, because that was the dominant food source for Indigenous groups on the plains in pre-contact times. Other common Saskatchewan archaeological artifacts are those from the post-contact, so after European colonization or the historic period. So I've got a lot of kind of fur trade images here, everything from Hudson's Bay Company beaver buttons, different types of glass beads, a lot of metal, a lot more metal, obviously, with the introduction of trade goods during the fur trade. Some wood does tend to preserve, as you can see in the case of this knife in the bottom picture, leather as well. So we see a lot more organic materials being preserved from the historic time period because it's that much younger than the archaeological sites that have come before it that date back over 10,000 years. Ceramics, right, that started to replace pottery after a while. The different patterns on ceramics that you can use to date and determine the manufacturer of those pieces and where they're coming from. Glass in many forms, from bottles to window glass, and everything in between. Tin cans, which are my personal favorite, I say with a great deal of sarcasm. There's nothing like cleaning rusty tin cans and trying to dry brush all the dirt off of them and getting a mouthful of rust, essentially. And leather soles from shoes as well. So we do definitely see a shift in the types of archaeological artifacts during the historic period, right? Because we have all those European goods that are coming into North America. Less common artifacts. Now, some of this is determined on whether or not these artifacts will preserve after being buried in the soil. In rare cases, we do get really great preservation techniques where organic materials like birch bark or hair or fur does last, but it is very, very rare when it does occur. That's why you hear a lot about mummies from Egypt, because they have the dry, arid conditions in which to preserve organic remains. We don't here. Or bog bodies, same difference, right? It's the right preservation environments that allow these artifacts or these specimens to not decay over time. So the one thing is that preservation bias, whether or not it can be preserved. So in the cases we have birch bark. Not as common. Basketry was probably used a great deal made out of local grasses and woods prior to the introduction of clay pottery on the plains. However, because it's grasses and woods, it's going to break down. So it's not preserved in the archaeological record. This cuff we have in the top corner is actually an example of something we pulled out of a historic site from the late 1780s north of Batoche called South Branch Heist. And it's just a cuff made from birch bark that happened to be in a midden or a kind of garbage dump feature that was just lucky enough and sealed enough that it preserved over time. However, the minute it's exposed to air, you have to worry about other conservation issues as it will start to decay in modern environments. So that's why Canadian Conservation Institute is such a great resource in teaching us how we can preserve this material so that it can be used for future research and for future study. We also have an example here of the different atlatls I was mentioning. So you see from this line drawing, we have an arm that's holding this atlatl thrower on which you put your spear point or your dart. And all that's going to do, as I mentioned, is it's going to allow you to throw things further and faster and harder, right? So it acts as an extension of your arm. So it's like if you grew another forearm, essentially, right? So the physics behind it allows it to be an adaptation and an improvement over just run-of-the-mill spear throwing technology where you just have that spear that you're throwing with all your might. One of the things we do find are atlatl weights. Now, the jury's kind of out on what atlatl weights actually are, whether they serve a functional purpose to atlatls. As you see in this picture, they are using it as a weight to help with balance on the thrower part. In some cases, that is true. They've done replication experiments where having a weight really depends on the person more so than the overall technology, so that some people prefer it, some people don't, right? But it doesn't really give you that much more of an advantage to have a weight if you didn't. So the neat thing about atlatl weights is they're often carved, right? And they're often carved as figures, animal figures. So that tends to be a little bit more rare. And we think this is because these were so highly curated, right? It's almost a form of hunting magic, so to speak, right? You would imbue the stone with an animal spirit that would hopefully give you a good luck in your upcoming hunt. And maybe that's why you attached it to your spear thrower arm. So for these reasons, they're not very common. They tend to be more of a Saskatchewan phenomena over a plains phenomena. Like you don't find a lot of atlatl weights in Alberta. They are far more numerous in this province. So that's probably because they are unique to the group who made them originally in and around that 5,000 to 7,500 year period. Another thing that we don't find as commonly is Clovis points. Clovis is the oldest projectile point known so far in North America. It's in and around 12 to 14,000 years old, depending on where you are. Tends to be a little bit younger up here, again, because we had that glacial ice covering the province. Until it started to retreat, people weren't moving as far north as they could, right? So southern US into Mexico, Clovis points can be in and around 14,000 years, but as you move north, they get slightly younger. So the ones in Saskatchewan are probably dating in and around the 12,000 year mark. The only problem is we can't test that for sure because we've never found a Clovis site. All the Clovis projectile points, and these are spear points, are surface finds. So they're found out of context without any other artifacts, without any other bone that we can date, probably picked off of fields. Back in the day, especially during the 30s, when there was a lot of land clearing, the dirty 30s eroding a lot of that lovely topsoil, so a lot more archaeological artifacts were exposed and farmers picked them up. So a lot of the site could have been destroyed. It is 12,000 years old, you know, it doesn't last forever. So we only have these single projectile points, these single spear points. And surprisingly, quite a few museums in the province tend to have at least one in their collection. So they're rare in that we don't find them in many archaeological sites, but the museums in this province seem to have a good line on them. And that's probably because they were donated by local farmers who amass these collections. Clovis points are stereotypical because they have something called a flute that's taken off of them. So from the base of the point, the stone tool maker would have removed a small flake of stone that extends up the length of the body of the spear point. So a hard thing to do, but that's how you can tell it's a Clovis point, because it's got that flute that's been removed from it. And these can vary in size too, from those larger spear points of 5 inches down to maybe 2 inches in length. The last two pictures on this screen is snow darts. So this was a pre-contact game, kind of like curling, kind of like bowling, right? Where we would take ribs, usually from a bison, and we'd shoot them across the ice or the snow, and they'd often have feathers attached to them. So these rib bones, some cases they've been hollowed out, as you can see in the black and white photograph. They've lost their feathers at this point, but in some cases this bone doesn't preserve very well, or it gets misidentified as something else, as maybe a bone tool or just a broken piece of bone. So that's typically the artifacts we find in Saskatchewan archaeological sites. Everything from your stones in your bones, your arrowheads, your different types of projectile points, your groove mauls, everything to a lot of metal and glass in the historic period. Okay, so now what do we do when you have these items in your collection? Obviously, the first thing is to find a way to identify them. Now, for a lot of people, that archaeological knowledge of the provincial history isn't necessarily there. So the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society has a number of different resources, as well as ourselves, that are here to guide you in identifying archaeological artifacts in your collection. So we've got everything from our guide to Saskatchewan archaeology, which is available as a PDF on our website, as well as the two fossil guides, the Common Fieldstone Fossils of Saskatchewan and a guide for identifying common rocks and fossil specimens found in Saskatchewan museums. That was written by a retired mining geologist / paleontologist who volunteers for our society. Because it can be hard sometimes to differentiate between what's just a rock and what's something that's been manipulated by human hands. Another great resource is this record in stone. Now, I know it says that it's familiar projectile points from Alberta, but we have basically the same types here. So these are some great resources to get you started. When in doubt, it's always great to contact the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society and talk to us, because we're happy to help identify artifacts, whether they belong to pre-contact archaeology or historic archaeology. We all have experience dealing with a variety of different types. So now what? I've got all these artifacts. I'm starting to figure out what they are. Every museum tends to have a different database for cataloging your collections. Ours varies too. I know Mass has a specific, I think it's based on collective access, that you use and you encourage your network members to use. We vary everything from just a simple Excel spreadsheet that breaks it down into basic categories like what it is, what it's made of, the dimensions of it, and if there's any modifications to it, to far more complex access catalogs for when we are accessioning it in our back room and we want to be able to have as much detail as possible uh, in the catalog. So whatever you use that works for you is great, as long as you know you've got those basic categories, you know, raw material, type, measurements. As doing research, I love having measurements, especially with stone tools, because that can help with a lot of different research questions that archaeologists look into. So what do you do with these things? Well, there's a number of different avenues that you can go down. What we encourage people to do is when they come to us with collections, whether it's an individual collection or a museum collection, is we encourage them to work with us to fill out something called the Saskatchewan Archaeological Resource Record, or a SAR form. This is a form that the government has available to people who practice archaeology in the province, and it's basically trying to find the locational information of where these artifacts were found. You can see on the map next to this form, there's a whole bunch of red dots, and maybe there you might be able to see a couple of yellow dots. They don't show up as well on the PowerPoint presentation. But this is a map of Saskatchewan archaeology that we've just updated. This has roughly 30,000 archaeological sites that are known by the province as of August 2020. So there's probably been a few more sites added to it since then. The map was originally done in 2015, and then in the last 5 years, we've added another 5,000 sites. Okay, so what the government likes to do is have a record of everywhere archaeology has been found, right? Historic, pre-contact, whatever, rock art sites, things like that. By filling out an archaeological resource record form, it helps to put a dot on that map. And then that helps for research purposes, obviously, people doing any kind of studies into specific aspects of Saskatchewan archaeology, but it also helps with development. The Heritage Property Act that came in, and I want to say 78, but it might be 82. Forgive me for not remembering the exact date. It regulates archaeology in the province. So anytime any kind of development occurs, whether it's mining, forestry, potash, housing, roads, usually an archaeological assessment is done first to see if there's any archaeology in the proposed impact area. If there is, the development company is required to hire an archaeologist who is affiliated with the province through their list of like consulting archaeologists to go out and do either excavation or surveying and basically figure out if there's an archaeological resource there and if it needs to be protected. If it's just a few pieces of stone flakes on the ground, we're not going to be as concerned, or the government isn't going to be as concerned about that being destroyed. The archaeologists on duty would collect them, write a report, tell the province, they would maybe put a dot on the map, and development would proceed as planned. In the cases of pipeline, there has been cases where pipelines have been moved in the past because they are impacting major archaeological sites that we don't want to destroy, right? And we don't want to dig them up. Once we dig them up, they are gone forever. So some cases, because it's such a rare site type, we'll tell people, move your pipeline, you know, and it costs a lot of money and it doesn't make you many friends, but it does happen in certain cases, especially if they're sites of special nature, something like burials, rock art sites, medicine wheels, effigies, things like that, stone alignments, right? We don't want to move those or destroy those in any way, shape, or form. So this database of archaeological sites and the power rests with the Heritage Conservation Branch through the Ministry of Parks, Culture, and Sport. They are the provincial regulators of all archaeology in the province. I think they cover paleontology as well, but they are the ones who have the database of all the sites. They will tell you if there's something there. They will, you know, keep all that record of that information for researchers as well. Another contact is the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, Dr. Evelyn Siegfried, who's the curator of Indigenous studies. Now, the RSM and the government have a special relationship in that the RSM has become the provincial repository of all archaeological collections. So whether it's private collections or museum collections or artifacts that have been excavated due to the course of research projects through the university, personal consulting firms, they all go to the RSM and they are stored there. And Evelyn is kind of the steward of all that archaeological artifacts. And she makes them available to people too for research purposes. She's also deals with repatriation. So if certain types of artifacts, pipes, sacred pipes, bundles, things like that, she helps repatriate them back to the requisite Indigenous community. She has an elders advisory council that she works with to repatriate a lot of this information. All right, so you've contacted them or you've contacted us, you've worked with us to fill out the SAR form, we've cataloged all the artifacts. What do we do next? Well, there's no reason your museum can't store them, right, or display them. I'm actually going to talk about a case study here in a minute and where we worked with a museum to store and display a fairly large collection. There's the potential to accession them to the RSM, and then they go into the RSM warehouses and they can be pulled out for future displays at the RSM. They can be used for research purposes. You know they're protected there and somebody knows where they are. That's a good thing. Or they can be repatriated, right, back to specific Indigenous communities. What our organization is really trying to do with every collection that we take in for the RSM, because we don't accept collections, but we will kind of be a holding place for collections prior to them being accessioned to the RSM. But we work with local communities to meet with their Indigenous neighbors and see if the Indigenous community would like those artifacts, if they have facilities where they would like it displayed, because it is their history as opposed to my Euro-Canadian history. So we really push working with Indigenous communities to repatriate artifacts so that they can have their ancestors' heritage with them. So that repatriation and that shared stewardship of the archaeology in the province, because it belongs to all the people of Saskatchewan and it's held in trust for the people of Saskatchewan by the Crown, which is the provincial government. So for that reason, we have laws that discourage the buying and selling of artifacts or the trading of artifacts. The artifacts that we find here should never leave the province, right? Because they are from Saskatchewan. And those who are found to be selling them or buying them could be charged under heritage laws. So I'm just going to take a drink of water here. So one example of us working with museums with a large archaeological collection is this Hertzic Morgan collection that is now at the Melfort District Museum. So they were contacted our organization in 2016, hence the lack of face coverings in this photo. This is a large collection, predominantly stone tools, but it did have artwork and metal and historic period objects in it. It comes in closer to 3,700 pieces than it does to 36. And it was collected in the 1960s and 1970s by an Isidore Hertzic in and around the Yellow Creek area or the Melfort area of Saskatchewan. So the interesting thing about Isidore Hertzic is he is the father of our Grace Morgan, who I'm sure some of you have heard about. Her book has been released posthumously, Beaver, Bison, Horse, The Traditional Ecological Knowledge of the Northern Great Plains by the U of R Press. So she is a very well-known archaeologist and anthropologist who worked in Saskatchewan and across the Prairie province. And so this is her father's collection. So he collected this huge amount of archaeological artifacts along with his grandsons, Jerome and Michael Morgan and Don Hertzic. Now, Jerome, Michael, and Dawn knew that this collection needed to be properly curated and properly displayed. One of Grace Morgan's requests before her death was that the collection be kept together and one day displayed for the benefit of the public in the history of the province. So hence, since it was collected in the Melfort area, it makes sense that it would go to the Melfort and District Museum. So they came to us because it was predominantly stone tools and asked about how best can we identify and catalog this collection, and then what do we do with it, right? How do we display it? So we got 2 internships from Young Canada Works at Building Careers in Heritage that Em had mentioned earlier in 2017 and 2018. So our first intern was Gabriel Lamarche. He is a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan who specializes in stone tools, and he did all the identification and cataloging, so making up those huge databases. And it took him a good 6 months to get through it. He was also assisted by our volunteer, Frank McDougall, the same individual who made those guides, the fossil guides, who spent 333 hours scanning each artifact on a high resolution scanner so we can have high res digital images of these artifacts. And then we hired a second intern once all that initial cataloging and identification was done, Katie Hanna, who is your next presenter in February, to do the interpretation and add it to Melfort's database system, right? She came up with 6 themes that would tie all these artifacts together for interpretive displays, including text panels for the exhibit cases. So I'll just show you a couple pictures here of the extent of the collection. Now, some of it was loose in boxes, especially the larger objects like the mauls and the hammerstones. The pottery was in a small box, but there were numerous, I want to say there was at least 15 cases, nice wooden cases with glass cupboards where all these stone tools were carefully laid out. So Frank is the one who numbered every one of these artifacts in the cases, took them out, scanned them in so we can sync the catalog with the pictures so we know exactly what we're looking at. We've got everything from different flakes, bifaces, drills, projectile points, bits of bone and teeth, you know, the pestles, the mauls, the pottery. So it was just extensive. It was an amazing collection to see, and it basically filled up our entire front room because there was so much of it. So what did Katie do? So after looking at all the collection, and of course having to import it into Melfort's collections database, that helped her really get a feel for what was there. She came up with 6 display themes about how to take these objects beyond just being a stone tool or a piece of bone or a piece of pottery to being more meaningful, to telling a story. So her first display theme was archaeology, of course. So introducing people to the concept of archaeology, what it is, who does it, why they do it, what do archaeologists find, what do we not find, right? So very, very basic introduction to archaeology. A theme on collecting, right? Because this was a collection amassed by an individual, a non-archaeologist, which honestly, I think that probably encouraged his daughter to go into archaeology after seeing her dad's collection. So who does archaeological artifact collecting and why? Is it professionals? Is it amateurs? You know, the problems associated with vandalism and pot hunting, those people who seek out artifacts for nefarious purposes to sell, right, to make money off of, or they destroy it because they don't care about history and heritage. Introducing as well the concept of different heritage legislations, how they change provincially, federally, and internationally. So the United States has very, very different laws regarding artifacts than we do in Canada. We don't have a federal heritage legislation. We only have provincial ones, and they're pretty much the same province by province, but there are slight differences. The overarching theme is don't sell them and don't let them leave the province. But in the States, if you own private land and you find an artifact, you can do what you want with it, right? You can sell it for millions of dollars if somebody's trying to buy it. And we have had issues in the past with Americans coming up here and trying to buy artifacts from Canadian archaeological sites. So there's issues in regards to legislation and tightening it up. The history of collecting in Saskatchewan as well, that the majority of what we know about Saskatchewan archaeology is based on collecting. Those farmers back at the turn of the 20th century, right, who found all these artifacts on their fields, right? So we don't say, oh, you shouldn't have done that. It's like, well, no, you essentially grab this material before it could be further destroyed, right? It forms the basis of provincial archaeology today, right? They were acting as stewards for this material in their time, and it has contributed to the growth of archaeology in the province. The other theme is food. So what types of animals are found in Saskatchewan through time, as we see environmental change going from ice age to more temperate climates during those different periods? What did people eat? What did they use as foods? So animals, plants, we can talk about doing residue analysis on pottery and on stone tools, like either looking at the blood or the starches. So the blood can be tied with DNA analysis to specific animal types. The starches can be tied to specific plant types, right? When do we see corn or maize and agriculture starting to develop? Indigenous agriculture, not agriculture coming over from Europe, but that too, the rise of farming and homesteading in the province. How did people hunt and gather, right? What technologies did they use? How did the horse and the gun change those hunting patterns and those technologies? How are people moving across the landscape, right? How do people cook or store their food, right? What's a buffalo versus a bison? Why do we care? Why do we call it two different things? What happened to this species over time? It's near extinction, right? And then the clearing of the plains for settlement, right? With a lot of immigrants coming over, right? So all that can be tied into specific artifacts under this food theme, you know, whether it's stone tools or bones or pieces of pottery, right? You can have a huge discussion about foodways. Home and family, so social and societal structures. Do we have small family groups that are traveling around, or do we have larger communal groups, especially during hunting seasons, right? If we have large scale bison kills, right, we're going to see a lot more people coming together. So how does their social structure and their societal structure change with that? What types of archaeological sites are there? Campsites, kill sites, you know, ceremonial sites. Where are people settling? River valleys, out on the open plains where they can get blown away, right? Then where are the resources that people are going to exploit? And social roles. So men versus women, old and young genders, things like that. You know, it can be a little bit harder to see in archaeology, but there's enough research done on social roles that you could start prizing out some really interesting discussions from that based on these artifacts. Trade and economy, and so cultural transmission, the movement of goods, of course, you know, materials, different rock types, shells coming from the Gulf of Mexico, things like that, as well as ideas and languages and how that changes over time. So we see this in artifacts like projectile points, the size, the shape, they change over time, the development of new technology. Fur trade, how the fur trade impacts trade and economy here, as well as talking about North America being settled by Indigenous ancestors 14,000 years ago or earlier. And then plants and medicine. So the plants are equally as important as bison to Indigenous groups in the past. They were a provision of food, they provided medicine and materials, so canoes, right? Snowshoes, things like that. how difficult it can be to see plant remains in an archaeological context. So we often need to use high-tech things like microscopy and residue analysis and things like that. But again, bringing in all those different professions and sciences to learn more about people in the past, right? What Katie also did was she tied all these themes and artifacts into how it fits into the Saskatchewan education curriculum from grades kindergarten to 10, right? A lot of social studies, obviously, but also physics, math, phys ed, right? That archaeology has facets in all these different subject matters that teachers can make use of. So we go from artifacts, we're moving beyond more of just a basic functional utilitarian approach to what it means to the people who made it. It's more than just a tool, it's more than just a piece of bone, right? The core of archaeology is reconstructing past behavior. So finding out what were people thinking when they were making or using this particular artifact. You know, was it something that they were just going to use once and throw away, or was it something they were going to hold on to, like maybe those addle weights, right? Can you see the emotion in the artifacts, right? And you can with further understanding. You can look at a broken projectile point and you can figure out, was this used? Was this used and it was used to kill something and that provided food for a family? Or was this broken before it could be used, you know, because of some external flaw in the material, or the person who made it just wasn't as good as they should have been at making it? And you can see the frustration in the rock from it snapping at a certain point and thinking, oh, that person must have been really, really upset and mad, having spent all this time on this one silly little projectile point, and then it snaps right as you get close to finishing it. So you can sense the frustration. You can see the jubilation if it's turned out beautifully and it works fine. We can look at the artistry of these artifacts as well, right? How finely made are they? Some are pretty cruddy, you know, basic one-time use things. It did its job, good enough, get rid of it. Others, you know, there's a lot of skill and artistry that went into it. It's something that was very meaningful to them or their group. We see this in sites as well as the artifacts. So another thing that's important to acknowledge is the role of modern Indigenous communities. So what knowledge do they have about these artifacts? How do they interpret them, right? How do these artifacts fit into their oral histories? You know, what knowledge are imbued in these objects that we can add to the overall display and narrative of an individual artifact from them, you know, incorporating not only Indigenous knowledge, but physics and geometry and geology and biology and all those different disciplines and fields of studies. So the takeaways I hope you get from this is the importance of the engagement with Indigenous communities, because without it, you really only have a small portion of the story. The ability to see these artifacts in a new light, right? They're increased educational content and value to them rather than just things that are neat to have on display. The incorporation of multiple lines of thinking and understanding of an artifact. So those different ways of knowing what these were used for and felt about. And the relatability and connection to modern populations, right? Especially during the historic period where we have a lot of new immigrants in Canada now, how they're very similar to the Euro-Canadian settlements, right? Strangers in a strange land, right? How they had to adapt to a new way of life, a new landscape, just as people did back in the day, back in the past. So all of these are core and common themes, human themes, regardless of the time period or the era that they belong to. And these artifacts help to tell that story and can really be used to flesh out the story. So another thing, just a little bit about our society quickly. As I mentioned, we're a nonprofit society funded by Sask Lotteries, a member of Sask Culture, founded in 1963. Our vision is connecting Saskatchewan's past to you. We're a membership-based organization with a mandate for public education. And in pre-COVID times, we offered over 20 plus programs and services, a lot of in-person programs and services, including an annual barbecue, our Archeo Caravan program, bus tours, exhibits, heritage fairs, public field schools. So we are planning, hopefully, fingers crossed, depending on health orders, to have a public and a school excavation at Fort Carlton this summer. We'll see, right? If hopefully everybody gets vaccinated and all that great stuff. We do a lot of outreach. Now it's more virtual, but we have educational kits too. So we offer identification and consulting services. So if you want to know more about what artifacts you have or archaeological sites, we work with the Heritage Conservation Branch to kind of disseminate that information. We have a number of educational resources, those text documents that I mentioned earlier, all available on our website for free download, as well as Archeo kits, which is basically archaeology in a box. Here's a representative sampling of typical archaeology artifacts you find in the province that you can use to display. Teachers love them, right? When they're studying fur trade history or Indigenous history, you know, like, look at all these cool things people used in the past. Activity kits that stemmed out of our Archeo Caravan program, and activities, everything from making rock art, ceramics, pottery, making stone tools in a safe way when we can get together in person. Outreach, as I mentioned, presentations such as this, and then our publication. So our Trappers and Traders Fur Trade card game is probably one of our most successful publications. It's a card game about living during the fur trade and learning how to trade and how did people trade and what did they trade for. And there's 4 groups. There's the Métis, the First Nations, the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Northwest Company. And this is a really great resource. It comes with a teacher's guide that's available on the website, right? That can delve into how it fits into the curriculum and larger questions you can ask. We currently have the cards translated into French, and we're almost have them translated into Michif and Cree. So that should be done hopefully in the next few months. We have a number of different books on Saskatchewan archaeology, some very thematic, such as the Boulder Monuments and the Cypress Hills Massacre. Probably one of the best sellers too is our map of Saskatchewan archaeology. That's an old picture up there, as I mentioned. We have a 2nd edition 2020 with 5,000 extra sites now that we literally just got from the printers on Friday. So that should be up and available for purchase very, very soon. So how to contact us. So we are available. Most staff is working from home right now, but someone's in the office Monday through Thursday, at least one person. So you can always give us a call or email us. Visit our website. It's got a lot of great things on it, or follow us on social media. We do quite a bit on social media, posting on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Every 2 weeks, our Throwback Thursdays deal with some aspect of Saskatchewan archaeology. So whether it's a site or an artifact type, it usually gets people talking, and it's a great resource to learn more about the archaeology of this province. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karin. That was really, really interesting. It was nice to see it tied together with the Hertzic Morgan collection, also from Melfort. I have been talking with some of the folks from Melfort and heard kind of the development as it's going on, but it was neat to learn more about that as well. So yeah, I'll just take a moment and open it up for questions if anybody has anything. Nothing's come through so far, but I just wanted to, of course, offer the opportunity. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything come through at the moment, but thank you again so much for your presentation. Yeah, really enjoyed it. And just a quick reminder again that the next chat will be on the February 3rd, by Katie Hanna, she had some great tie-ins to the things that I was speaking about before. So that was great. And yeah, she'll be talking about identifying and changing problematic language in museum exhibits through real world examples from the Western Development Museum. So that's going to be a really great one too. So yeah, thanks everybody for your time this morning, and we will see you on the 3rd.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.